Wadiah is going to take us to Baltimore. She's engaging a topic that is pretty relevant right now, pretty much in the news, in your face. And she's going to show us a way in which architecture and urbanism can help to facilitate activism. Her committee was comprised of Lindsay May as the chair, Ronit Eisenbach was here a second ago. I hear her voice. There she is. And myself and Wadiah. It's all yours.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking my thesis chair, Lindsay May, for lots of great conversations that got me pumped about my role as an architect. The rest of my committee, Ronit Eisenbach and Professor Kelly, about really helping me design a space that's true to the place that it's in. My friends and family, essentially, in studio for being awesome, and especially my parents for being incredibly supportive throughout this whole process. So, I would like to begin this presentation where I began this thesis, which is by reflecting on the moment that we're in today. It's an intense moment of urgency and constant action. The past year has been one eventful one, to say the very least. At moments, this has been a moment of confusion, of fear, and exhaustion. It can feel like we are irreparably divided. At other moments, it's a moment of energy and hope. Most of all, though, this is a moment in which people are continuing to come together in masses to stand up for their friends and neighbors, for what they believe in, and against injustices that have gone on for too long. So the moment we're in today is a result of many trends in social trends and historic trends, but what I'm interested in is what in particular has allowed the level of activism that we are engaging in today. The answer to me is two-pronged. One is the ever-essential the people who are working tirelessly behind the scenes to sustain the conversation, to lead the action, and to bring out the masses of people to these events. The second element that's unique to today is the internet and its incredible capacity to bring together and connect people. So today, activism really happens simultaneously between the digital and physical realms. And it's imperative that as designers of the built environment, we recognize this and that the physical public space changes and adapts to accommodate the sea change. So this thesis explores the unique ways in which grassroots organizing happens in the digital age and proposes an architecture of activism that really embraces and embodies principles of digital space and digital activism and brings those to the public realm. To begin to understand how we can do this, we have to understand the ways in which digital space is different from physical space and therefore how it affects the conversations that we have in both. Some of the characteristics that really distinguish this are customization, so your ability to curate our worldviews on social media and digital space. And this sometimes has the negative effect of deepening the silos that we are already a part of. Then there's asynchronicity, which is a feature that literally gives us extra time to think before we speak, but that oftentimes can encourage us to start to speak in sound bites and hurts the art of dialogue. Then there's anonymity, which is perhaps kind of the most popular offender, which basically decreases inhibitions and allows for instability and even sometimes hostility in these environments. Then there's global scale. So today, of the 7.6 billion people on Earth, 51%, so more than half, are already using the internet, so they're collectively organizing this digital public realm. Then, in order to understand how all of this affects the nature of activism today and the way that these activities are happening, I looked at movements that have grown in this unique moment. So first of all is Black Lives Matter, which is a movement that was really built from a hashtag to raise awareness about police shootings of unarmed Black men. This is a movement that has really been grown by individuals who have driven the online conversation and taken their Twitter followers with them as they moved from location to location where these protests were happening. As we visualize and compare the online conversation and the physical action that's happening, we can see how intrinsically connected the two are and how intrinsically connected these spaces are. So at moments throughout this process, sometimes the conversation would drive the action, and at other times the action would drive the conversation. But both of them really go hand in hand, and that's an important observation. What this thesis aims to engage with is really the in-between points between those surges, where people and leaders are organizing and planning and bringing people to the demonstrations. This leads us to our first spatial principle that comes from digital activism. So Black Lives Matter demonstrated the power of hashtags to organize community around conversations. Physical spaces for activism should be as seamless to join as a hashtag conversation. They should be able to extend their influence beyond their immediate confines and pull people in and push action out. Second, we have the Women's March. This is a movement that, as compared to the Black Lives Matter movement, in this case it grew from a Facebook group. The Facebook group acted as a safe space in the digital realm. Participants of this movement extended this essential principle of safe space and brought that to the physical realm by establishing local hubs that were safe spaces for people to gather in and share their stories. They further continued that and extended the physical presence of this movement with the pussy hats that really took over the demonstrations wherever they were happening and became a very real and tangible symbol for the movement. Organizers of the Women's March established a network of both online and physical safe spaces through the yarn stores, so online and physical yarn stores, as well as virtual and physical marches that were happening all around. This is a movement, along with the Me Too movement that's been going on, that's really built on this idea of storytelling. And storytelling is something that is made infinitely easier by the landscape of platforms that social media allows us to have. So today, 5 new social media accounts are created every second. So that's 5 more people who gain a platform from where to speak. A space that is dedicated to activism should embody the same principle. So grassroots organizing is based on individuals getting up and speaking their piece, and it can provide the same landscape of platforms as well. Finally, we have the third spatial principle that goes across all of the digital activist spaces, which is a linear experience created by the timeline that is featured on most social media sites. So this allows us to experience spaces and discover things that we are interested in a linear way. So each of us on average, for example, right now, spends about 3 hours a day scrolling through approximately 72 feet of content. And so an activist space in the physical realm can embrace a similar kind of linear experience of discovery. Then, in order to understand how we can bring some of these principles to the existing physical space of activism, we have to question what the physical space of activism is today. Currently, it usually occurs in uninviting and ignored spaces of church basements and school gyms and behind anonymous facades. Something that I think, especially in today's day and age, is not worthy of the level of action and activity that is happening. We need to create a space that empowers and gives a space to the neighbor and the volunteer and the leader to do the work that they're doing at a local level. For this, I decided to study the city of Baltimore because it already has a strong network of nonprofits and organizations working in the community. We can start to look at the city as a landscape of public amenities and assets that are available to people to engage with in this activity. From there, we can look further at intervening at a neighborhood level. In this case, I selected the Gray Street neighborhood in East Baltimore. Sure.
What are the blue squares?
Oh, sorry. The blue squares are libraries, so this is kind of an overview of the shades of pink show levels of community engagement in different neighborhoods. The blue squares are libraries, the yellow dots are schools. So this neighborhood is centered on Madison Square Park and nestled in between different zones of influence. So you have the institutional influence of Johns Hopkins, you have the cultural influence of the Charles Street corridor, as well as the emerging influence of North Avenue. Continuing to look again at a neighborhood level at the kind of the public space available to people. We have existing activist hubs at places like the Living Well and the Impact Hub and the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum, and then you also have the kind of usual spaces like schools and churches and recreation centers that are all available to people, as well as parks. This is also a useful site because it's kind of a typical neighborhood park which occur across Baltimore, so it's a nice place to be able to test out kind of a prototype for a neighborhood activism center. It's also typical in that there are several vacancies around the site of houses and of empty lots, which is kind of a typical condition in Baltimore, so seeing how we can engage with that. And there are existing community assets like the recreation center, the school, and several churches that would be complemented by this new program. So the series of simple kind of interventions in this particular site, we can help to unify it and make it a more productive space that extends the influence of public buildings into the public space and makes it a more unified and productive space for the community. So within the top left corner is where thesis intervention happens. So it holds that corner and is comprised basically of 2 blocks of program, the town hall and the main workspace. So the Neighborhood Activism Center at Madison Square Park embodies principles learned from digital spaces of activism, including the promenade, that allows the individual to experience and explore and discover causes and organizations and communities that they might be a part of without necessarily engaging with them. So being able to observe and be curious before taking the next step of engagement. It adapts the idea of adjacency similar to hashtags where you can go from kind of a casual social conversation, turn that into a plan of action, and then execute it all in the same place and easily move from one space to the next. And then finally, the idea of the platform, in this case, manifests in multiple opportunities of stages where people can easily get up, claim the space, and basically make a call to action or address a group. So here we have the main approach to the Neighborhood Center of Activism. Because this is meant as a local community hub, it is a humbly sized building that complements and partners with the existing program of churches and other community assets. It opens up the corner and invites people in through a wraparound porch and a stoop that mimics the typology of the row homes nearby. As you enter the ground floor, the main space that you enter through is the advisor's lounge, so this really gives people the access to the main resource that is important for grassroots organizing, which is other people. So to be able to come together and advise and counsel and continue to grow the movements and the organizations that they're building. This is also where they can get access to training spaces and digital resources, as well as a public bathroom, among other things. It's also where they enter the main promenade for the individual experience throughout the building. As you continue up the promenade, you arrive at the main action core, which is essentially the shared workspace that centers the building and from which other offices and meeting spaces branch off. As you can see, the promenade element really wraps the space as you continue up. Then the top floor, the space opens up onto a balcony that extends the workspace outside and also provides expansive views of the park and the city at large. And finally, in the next building over, the town hall grounds the community in community events and then extends all the way out to the park and the pavilion, as well as connects back to the main building. So, overall, this building is intended to bring in the neighbor, the volunteer, and the leader, to take them and give them the resources that they need to build the causes that they're working on, take them through that journey, and then reconnect them back out into the community. In this building, or in this program, you can engage with the building and with the events happening as an individual, so you can experience it through the promenade. And it encourages curiosity and engagement without necessarily obligating you to engage. Then, as you continue, you could start to develop the project that you were working on through something as small as a shared desk that could grow into an office, that could grow into a permanent office, or even just hosting meetings. So providing a variety of different options of gathering and meeting. And then finally, multiple opportunities to engage back with the community at several different scales. And then this also connects back to the park to continue to do that. So overall, the Neighborhood Center of Activism at Madison Square Park provides an opportunity for the individual to go through the process of becoming an activist, just as it allows an organization to go through the process of building a movement. So, this is the beginning of an architecture that builds on principles learned from digital space, and therefore caters to activism in the moment that we are in today. Thank you.
Who wants to be an activist? We all are. Hi.
Hi.
Great concise delivery of your project. Very succinct. I'm just going to start with a general question. Hopefully everybody feels asks other questions. Why does this have to be related to a park? Mm-hmm. If you set up these sort of series of programs that sort of link with this promenade, which I guess is your timeline, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Can it be anywhere in Baltimore? Does it have to have anything to do with the park? Because I was expecting actually at the park, besides that pavilion, that you have that's sort of like the thrust of that town hall into the park. I was expecting the park to actually be another programmatic element. The sort of analog version of activism, where this is sort of like a digital interpretation of it. Can this happen anywhere in Baltimore? Besides, does it need that park? Why that specific site? I guess is my question.
Right. I think the park presented itself as an opportunity. It's definitely intended that, especially considering it's not a very large building, that activities that would happen here would naturally grow and extend into the park. So for example, if a particular organization has an office here, but they have a community engagement event or a barbecue or anything of that sort, that would engage with the park. So the park was kind of more lightly designed, but yes, this was intended as an intervention at more of a neighborhood level, so within a residential community, and in that case, the park typology was important versus a more urban setting. So that answers your question.
It does. So it could still happen without a park?
Yes, I suppose
but it
so.
would be a different version,
right.
I guess.
Right. I think some of the principles could still be translated, though.
I have a question. So
Sure.
is the intention that groups would come here to train to be activists, or activities take place in the building?
My intention was that both would happen, essentially. So if you are, for example, building or starting to build an organization or a small group, and you've met some people who are interested in advocating the same causes, you could easily kind of come and start off with just, for example, a small desk, and that could grow into an entire office, and then once they're established enough, they'd actually probably move into their own space. But then also, members of the neighborhood could come through and receive trainings in, digital tools, for example, or in actually organizing. So it would be a little bit of both.
So this, in your mind, is this sort of a think tank kind of non-profit place, or is this a public building? Like, what is the entity in which would operate this building?
Right. I think it's imagined more as a blend of like a co-working space, essentially. So with a little bit of kind of an institutional. Some of the organizations, for example, that might take a leadership role in organizing the collective events that would happen, but overall it's meant not necessarily for a single think tank, for example, there are some of those in Baltimore, but for multiple organizations from different backgrounds to come together.
So your model is kind of an open platform work space that has resources that
kind of serve
groups
everyone.
would, okay. How is having a little trouble with the leap from the premise to the need for the building, only in that I'm trying to like, what are you offering in a single place that isn't already like part of a public library program or other public or civics, institutions that have gathering spaces? I guess it's more of a rhetorical question. So that's what I'm struggling with. Like, do you have an answer that's looking for a problem, or are you creating something, a new typology that's necessary? I'm not sure, and I'm not so sure why there's two separate buildings with this little space in between them. Like, I understand program. Like, why isn't that one big building? So I'm struggling with a lot of the premises, and maybe other folks have better ideas than me.
I too. I actually had a question. At one point you said that the average amount of time is 150 minutes that people spend on these kind of things per day. And that translates to 75
Higher,
feet.
72 feet. 3 hours.
3 hours
Right.
translates to 75 feet.
Yes.
Linear.
Of what?
Scrolling.
Scrolling, if you were to tape it on the ground.
Right.
And to my, okay, and then so.
That's where your thumb hurts.
Okay, but in a sense, I'm saying, so what? I mean, because I don't know what the it's kind of an interesting thing, but so how does that affect? And hopefully I'll get to the point. Occasionally I get a bit elliptical, but and the problem with that kind of statistic or information is it's fascinating as a thing, but then I'm thinking, okay, 75 feet. Does that mean I need 75-foot corridor? Does that mean I need 75 feet, or should I rest my fingers more? I don't know what the consequence of that particular thing is, and I certainly don't know architecturally, except it sounds provocative. And I go, ooh, yeah. I mean, I fixed on it right away. And I was going, but what does that mean? And I think I may be on the same path as Maria there, is that I'm going, I'm hearing all this, and I'm so positively inclined towards what you're trying to do. And I don't know necessarily that I go right back into a building per se. I am thinking the idea of looking at new prototypes of space. In the back of my mind, there was an exhibit at MoMA in the late 60s called Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, right? We weren't in one, but it would be, with respect. But it was a really, really, really important exhibit of all this thinking about domesticity. And interestingly, what the ramifications and what it looked like in the Super Studio, Activism, and all these people were putting stuff up, all with conjectures about what might be. And the reason I say that, it was enormously energetic, it was enormously exciting. And this doesn't have that. This doesn't have the heroicism or speculation. This gets very conformist. It could be a group house of some sort. It gets sort of flat, and yet what you're talking about is hugely exciting. And your diagrams, incidentally, your graphics are really fabulous. I mean, you really have they're very exciting, they're very clear, they're very easy and evocative and stimulating. And it's sort of, this feels like, oh, I've got to do a building because I'm doing an architectural thesis. And I'm not so sure I would necessarily agree with that. I do think that you have to test the validity of some of the arguments and look at them sociologically and say, okay, so what happens? Rather than me texting my friend in Seattle about something, or Trump does something else and I get really mad and I put it up there, whatever, and it creates a community, but it doesn't really, because there's no real constructive thing about it, except everybody feeling pent up in rage. Where's the architectural thing? Where's the spatial thing? Where's the interactive? And how do we embrace it? Much more importantly, how do we enable it? And I think these are all really valid coming from your thing. And I'd love it if you took some stabs at it, going, well, what do we need? Well, we need a good power source for one thing. We need a really, really, really good internet thing so it doesn't constantly fail and bail out. Okay, are there physical ramifications of those? Do we need to be dry? Do we need to be together? Do we need to be able to park our bikes? There's lots and lots and lots of speculation, I think, that comes right from your initial premise.
Right.
That it gets me super excited and begging you to take it on. Because the architecture is flat by comparison. everything else is so provocative. So somebody else want more.
Claudia, can you respond to that? Any of these comments?
Yeah, so I think the idea was I think part of it was to really test it out in a
Yeah.
spatial way. So I guess that's why it didn't turn into interventions kind of at a landscape level. For example, I wanted to see how this would translate to something physical and real. And I really do think going back to some of the examples I was showing of the activist spaces that are in the city, I really do think, and as well as conversations that I had with a lot of those groups, a lot of them expressed the need to be in a space with other organizations and with people working on similar topics. So I think the need for a collective space that had enough space, in that case a building, that had enough space to bring together and provide space for those organizations was kind of maybe became the stronger impetus, and that led me to developing a building. But I do understand your point.
So test it, right? I need 5 people together.
Right.
I need it to be quiet, noisy. I need this amount of power. I need different kind of tables. And try it. See what it does.
Continuing along the same discussion, I have some other ideas and questions. It's a really powerful idea, and if cities, across the nation could sort of develop these little, like your word, think tank, active tanks, it would be great. What's missing for me is you're trying to bring people together in physical space and not only digital space.
Right.
So the reality of this is there has to be a lot of technology in this building, which is probably going to inform those spaces, because that's part of what brought these people into the movement in the first place. And so I could imagine if Baltimore wants to talk to, Boston or
Right.
something like that, or Baltimore wants to talk to DC, and these different groups want to be able to kind of share information live, that there's going to be another layer of stuff which might inform the spaces, because it really is, it's not just screens and stuff like that, but it's we see the jumbotrons when we, go to the marches in DC. So I think there's another layer of reality.
The museum, that's what you were talking about. I was thinking about how the museum's kind of the model for what you're doing. Like I'm processing, you've had, what, a year to work on this,
Sure.
so I'm still processing this. But maybe that is the kind of model of different types of spaces that are really, about information, sharing information at different scales. And so maybe, in a way, your building doesn't represent the context. I think also part of the struggle, maybe this is what Robert was saying, is like, why this space? Why is this the most dynamic space? I mean, you chose very thoughtfully about how this could be an opportunity, but what you're doing is so much bigger than this little cozy neighborhood. It should be like across from the UN, right? Like an in-your-face, like, hey, here's the place that everybody knows to go. You can get the skills. You can record a podcast. You can record something, and you can be seen. And that's really expressive of your building. So maybe it's just a matter of taking all your thoughts and spending time on the building and really making this an incredible design.
I actually, I'm sorry.
That's a good thing.
For fighting.
Listening. No, I think your building, at least one of them, is very dynamic, and one of them is very static. And I don't know if that's deliberate on your part. I mean, in terms of this kind of, and the separation between the two seems very intentional. But I'm not.
Sure, I can speak to that. So the intention was really, part of the reason to have 2 separate buildings was to create a connection, again, back to kind of the residential alley behind, but also to articulate both of them differently, so that the town hall was really something that read as solid and grounded and part of the park, and it also extends physically into the park. And then the main building with the workspace is meant to appear more kind of, it has a central core, but really the spaces are branching off of it and gives the idea of something that can grow and something that can adapt. So the articulation was meant to be slightly different.
But the problem with that idea is that you're creating walls that all of this digital stuff is supposed to be breaking down, and you're you're artificially limiting this kind of idea of the promenade by not letting it really engage, the site in multiple ways, and also to engage the interaction between the two buildings in different ways. So, I just want to see that porch thing actually be on the town hall, because that's where you can really project and engage at the scale of the park, right? Because that porch thing, which is very powerful kind of moment, it seems like whatever's going on up here is totally disengaged from the park. There's nothing here to engage the park at larger scale. You're only engaging it here in a kind of very immediate way. And that's problematic because of cars and traffic and all the rest. So unless you're using this as a big projection screen or something where you could actually, really broadcast, information, I'm struggling with that. But I really want to bring this across also to allow the scale of this to talk to that, which I think, again, is intentional on your part. And, the proportions that are going on here, the interaction between the frame that you created, I want to see more dynamism between this kind of regular frame and these things pushing and pulling against it, the kind of tension and the dynamic quality that has real potential from these elements as you've set them up. And so there should be something breaking through here. There needs to be maybe a little bit more confrontation. Your building's maybe not confrontational enough, or?
Because one is a civic government building, the other is a civic public building.
Right.
And it would be interesting if they overlap and talk to each other.
I'm going to ask a slightly controversial question. If you were doing your thesis and you didn't have to do a building, same idea,
Right.
what would it be?
So,
Because, and I'll let you answer, because I think everything that you're showing, I get the thesis of what you're trying to sort of present, but everything that you're showing sort of reverts back to an analog, conventional sort of way of, that's just a nice community center. Everything that you've addressed in that community center, without what you've said about your thesis, that's what a community center should be. Procession, as you go from space to space, it should be as legible as you're sort of implying it in the right side of the building. But going back to your thesis idea, if you were to because to me, in my mind, I'm thinking you're looking at trying to do architecture with this new paradigm in the back of your head, sort of guided to create a new type of architecture, as opposed to a conventional type of architecture, which led me to ask you, if you weren't doing a building, what would it be?
Right.
So I was thinking of a terminology, and I was like, architecture, technology, techitecture. If this is this new paradigm that you're trying to create, and it might not manifest in a physical space per se, like the new notion of activism is sort of like, I get on my phone, I create a hashtag, I connect to 10 million people on Twitter. How do you make a building out of that? It might not represent itself in the physicality of sort of like an old adage of like building and programmatic arrangement in a box, which I think you've created here. I think it's a very strong idea, as the gentleman was saying over there, but I wonder if this is the vehicle to sort of get that forth. And it might be something quite different than this, that is not about, you have a porch and like a kitchen and like that to me is sort of like the analog version of what you're trying to say, which I think is very digital. It's sort of like it's something I can't conceive of, and that's your charge. If I were in your thesis, I'd probably sit down and brainstorm about it, about what it could be. But I don't think it's this. This is just a nice community center, right? Which you see all the time. And there's questions about, the organization that even starts attacking it. Is it even a nice enough community center in the old analog way of thinking versus this new thought process that you have going. So, great work, but I just think, in my mind, I'm thinking it could manifest in something other than a physical, yeah.
Do you want to say something?
Pass it on. But I did test out other options. For example, in one case, more of just a corner approach, so really just creating a corner intervention that would happen across the city and could be something that identifies neighborhoods and you can engage between them. I think, again, going back to, I really believe that activism starts at home, and that especially in cities like Baltimore, the local communities need to be empowered. So a building that really belonged to the site and to this neighborhood became important, rather than, so I guess like balancing between manifesting the digital ideas and
But
creating
does that happen within four walls anymore, though? It's all happening in the digital.
She's offering the transition. So
Right.
I think that's what you're saying, is that there needs to be.
The physical, exactly.
I'm just interpreting.
No, I agree. Right.
You need the analog, like the maturity of a movement is certainly once you're in bricks and mortar, that means you're actually advanced, right?
Yeah.
And that's what, that's what any practice aspires to have, bricks and mortar, the analog experience of what we are. So this is the transition you're offering.
Exactly. It also goes back to kind of the characteristics of digital spaces of conversation gathering that I was talking about, and how those can sometimes become problematic and in a way limit the effect of the activism that's happening. So I do think a physical space for that action is important. Another thing is, it was important to me for the answer not to result in things like big screens or megatrons or anything that was necessarily technical, but more an analog translation of digital principles.
So, Wadiah, I just wanted to jump in a little bit, having been the third member of your committee who saw it every once in a while. A couple of things is, I do agree that the architecture could use further development. I think we've had some ideas about that. I think there's two other important ideas that you haven't mentioned, and one is the notion of shelter, right? That there is something, I think, about creating physical spaces for people to actually be sheltered in this work and to come together. And that we have bodies, and the face-to-face interaction also helps us do this work, right? So that people aren't others anymore. And to me, that's the potential and importance of actually creating physical spaces that protect and support the activism. I'm not going to comment on the building itself. I do think it could be pushed forward. I think it should be brown, and, like a whole bunch of things you could work with. But I think in a certain way, you needed another step. And it was to go back to those diagrams, and we should have actually, the representation of this space isn't helping you. We should have seen this filled with people. We should have seen the ground plane of the park at some point with lots of people in it. We should see it at night. We should see people moving out of it, so that it's about something that happens over time, and the way it allows for smaller kind of connections and kind of moving out and vans going out, and then ultimately a diagram that shows how this is one of a network of things all over. And so then it connects back to the idea of the way, Facebook connects people. Facebook connects people who know each other more, right? And Twitter connects people who doesn't know each other. So you take this as a node that goes back to the digital idea of connecting, and that, we would want to see this kind of thing in other places at different scales. And really showing how, I think the park, you still needed a lot more work on that park, right? How does it have smaller spaces and larger spaces? How is it just a park for the community, but how does it also get filled like we see for, more people going there for other events? So to me, there's another set of boards that pulls back to your diagrams of kind of this connection, and then I think also the representations shouldn't have been all at the same time of day with the same kind of activities. Should give us the sense of, of activism and change. And that could help. But good work.
Thank you.
And good work, I should say.
So I apologize, I missed most of what some of what you introduced. I want to compliment you on a number of things. Number one, your ability to stand there and respond so effectively to the comments that are being made. That's great. The second thing is that you really made quite a nice building within the framework of, making modern architecture. Responding, it's very interesting. I can tell from your drawings, I guess, that you're across the street from that church. And so in terms of symbolizing community or marking community or the intensive community, it's an interesting juxtaposition where the church makes this solid tower on the corner, and then you make an open void, on the corner across the street. As conventional as that might be, that's a clever juxtaposition in terms of, inviting people into your building. And then the formal development, moving into the sort of double-story space and so on. So once in a while, I allow myself to be engaged in my community. And when we have community meetings that draw any number of people, we're usually in the, what do they call it? Used to be a library in the elementary school, but now they call it something else. I don't know what. Yeah, something like that. Some sort of center, which is just absolutely awful, and you have to endure hours of this community meeting in this awful space. So, it would be great to have this community space be adjacent to a park, be able to get, did I see morning coffee there? Yeah. Be able to get morning coffee, have reasonable conversations, So you've deployed the sort of symbols of, spatial symbols of modern architecture very effectively adjacent to the church. I have some concern about the extent to which you overwhelm the church with your building. So there's something about the scalar aspect of this thing that worries me somewhat. Maybe those elevations got drawn late in the game. I'm really glad that you drew them, however, because you can't see that stuff until you do draw, and it might make you rethink a little bit about what the scale of your building is, given the comparative level of sort of prominence, appropriate kind of prominence of these things in relationship to one another.
Sure.
Nice project. I'm glad you're making architecture.
Yeah, I am too. I want to go back to what Edgar Adams said, something about the one building that had a kind of dynamic quality to it, and the other one that had a more of a kind of static kind of quality to it. And I'm wondering if there could be more self-awareness of that in the project, in that, and it probably requires something other than a big reveal between the two. I think it really requires some element of dynamism within the thing that is more static, and some element of stasis within the thing that's more dynamic, or some kind of datum or some kind of constant that weaves the two of them together. The more and more I looked at the piece over to the dynamic piece, the place that has all those activities in it, more and more I'm thinking like why couldn't it be more like the Snyderman House, the now defunct Snyderman House by Michael Graves, which was this incredible frame that had all of these planes scooping in and out of it and doing all kinds of, it doesn't look like any of the things. When I say the word Michael and Graves, you're thinking little keystones and this is none of that. This is the Corbu phase Michael Graves, when Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman sat across from each other, had conversations based on which page of the Oeuvre Complete was turning them on that particular day. So I sort of imagine this thing even opening up even more, being more dynamic, having pieces that reach out, having pieces that pull in, back and forth. And then it makes me think that then the thing next door has to be something that is more directly engaged, that the slot, that the big reveal between the two isn't hacking it. I'm thinking that maybe the reference there is the relationship between the chapel and the monastic compound at La Tourette, where, and all my references go back to that kind of why. But the chapel is this really kind of constant piece. And yet when you get inside of the chapel, there are these moments of restlessness. They're the minor note, right? The major note is the stability of this kind of, this absolutely solid prismatic volume. And then the thing that you get on the other side is you get a fairly agitated kind of version of a monastery, but then there are these moments of dead rest. The chamber, the cells that the monks live in are proportioned. I remember lying there one day going, oh my God, this is the same proportion as a casket where I will lie at rest forever, right? So there's this kind of interesting kind of back and forth between those two things. And I think there needs to be that between these two moments in the building. And I actually like the kind of notion that maybe there is a typological ambiguity here. That this might be a rethink of a library. It might be a rethink of a community center. It might be this is just if we call it something else to start with, it might bring us to some place that reveals us. Just like I was saying before about Jake's drawing over there, the ambiguity of that allows us to get to some place new that we haven't been before.
Oh, this is a great world. One's Platonic and the other one's Aristotelian.
There you go.
So, one
they don't quite
last
need-
question, sorry. I'm enamored by the promenade, because you mentioned timeline earlier, and I'm fascinated by, again, your thesis. But if you were to diagram it in your axon, like make it like red, right? Where does it end? And I wonder if it can actually end in a window overlooking the park as it pierces the town hall and comes back. It just sort of, it doesn't resolve itself, and you've made it such an emphasis that if you were to sort of gray tone your section and you just in bold red show this timeline, this promenade that's touching all these programmatic elements and is revealing something new as you're wrapping yourself, and then it pierces the other volume, right? And you look down and see the activism going on. Where does it resolve itself? And actually, it's actually a existential question. Where does the timeline? How does it resolve itself? Does it just live in infamy in the digital sphere, or right? Or you log? So I would, since you've laid down the thesis and this is sort of what your architecture is following, I'd be very curious to see how you resolve it. And I think in your elevation, I'm looking at that lower Eden Street elevation where the promenade starts at that door, that brown door, and it goes up the stairs, and it actually pierces the envelope into space, right in front of that church. And I think that's brilliant. And then it winds itself back into the volume and crosses over into the other side, into where that lady in red is. But then it kind of peters. I'm like, where's the end of the journey? But it'd be interesting if it actually came back and started out in the park as a window looking out into the park. I think that'd be interesting.
Wadiah, I think your presentation was fantastic, and I'm really glad that you did this thesis. I think that it is a exploration in typology because we have something that is really successful and a big cultural change, and as you said, a sea change that's happening in the digital realm, and the built environment is not caught up. The coffee shop is not good enough for this use. A library is not good enough for this use. A community center is probably not good enough. So I'm really glad that you're exploring this technology and how it can adapt and how the built environment can catch up with the digital environment.
Thank you.
So I had some more prepared remarks, but I've thrown them out the window. So first of all, I guess I'm going to turn it back to you really quick. Is there anything you want to address or respond to? Give you the floor once more before we wrap up.
Not necessarily. I guess I'm, really happy that this topic and the exploration excited everyone, and I definitely intend to continue to engage it. I do think that this is definitely, a way of looking at architecture and digital space that we need to engage with as designers of the built environment. So I'm excited to continue to do that. Thank you.
So I have a few notes here that are more prepared than off the top of my head, but less prepared than my other comments. So here goes. So this is a real thesis, and this is a real thesis conversation. A thesis doesn't feel comfortable or suave or like a walk in a park. It's about taking a stance and sparking a conversation. And you're not getting softball questions because you didn't take on a softball thesis. And I think that's a testament to you, to your commitment to making the world a better place, to engaging in things that really matter and that will be mattering in the future. The conversation we had today was about teasing apart the nature of how we use and operate public space. We all walk around, sleep, eat, vote with a mini digital window on our hip. So there's limits, and I mean that brings up the limits of what we can do in digital space. And I think you've analyzed those and come to a conclusion about where physical space needs to come in, and so how those two interact. So I think this project is about the productivity of face-to-face interaction, and knowing, I'm confident, that you are the face of the digital sort of next generation, and as an architect, the face of the built environment. And so I think no one is better prepared, and no one knows those two things better than you and your cohort. And maybe we could all sort of learn from your commitment to it. So thank you for sharing all this work with us. Thank you for sparking such a heated and exciting and sort of roller coaster conversation, because that's what this topic is about. Thanks, Wadiah.